Hello, everyone, and welcome to the I Think Therefore podcast. This podcast is about all kinds of things, but in particular, it is about belief. It is about how hard sometimes it is to believe in things, how easy it is sometimes to believe in things, and why both of those things are the same thing. Actually, I don't really know that, but we're going to ask that question. We're going to ask a lot of questions here about belief. We're going to ask a lot of questions about the way things are. I hope that you come to this podcast with an open mind. I'm going to try to explain a little bit about what I want this podcast to be and what I don't want it to be. Certainly, if we're going to be talking about things like religion and belief and subjective experience, we're going to definitely have to set a few ground rules for discussion around this. And, this is a big part of what I want this podcast to be. We're going to hear from a lot of experts, philosophers. I'm going to try to book some guests on the show, religious leaders, philosophy leaders, thought leaders, people who are into physics and trying to answer cosmological, ontological questions. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Huge shout out to Aimee Miller, who donated $50 to our podcast. She is absolutely amazing. She's been a huge supporter of mine for a long time. And Aimee, I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for all of your support throughout the years. And I really hope you enjoy this. And I hope to get your feedback on this. I think there are a lot of people out there who follow me on social media who understand and know that I've kind of been asking a lot of these questions. And I feel like I'm pretty... I'm excited to talk to other people about them now. For a long time, I wasn't. I wanted to kind of keep this as a part of my private life, not something I wanted to publicize. But now I'm ready to publicize it, and I'm pretty excited about it. So I'm really looking forward to talking to people like Aimee and hearing from people like Aimee who have been fans for a long time, and I know are thinkers. Thinking people. Which is, one of the things I'm probably proudest of in my career is that I've kind of attracted smart people to follow me and to listen to me and interact with me. And that's exactly the way that I want this to continue to be. So, by all means, please share the podcast. Also want to give a shout out to Canyon Geisleman, as well as Rob Moore and Casandra Bright. All three of you, thank you so much for donating to the podcast as well. I know I've got a lot of supporters out there who are familiar with my background in religion, and we're going to get into that, by the way, quite a bit, actually, a little bit later on in the podcast. There are some issues when it comes to speaking about specific religions that I kind of want to veer away from, because I don't really want this podcast to be about judging somebody else's beliefs initially. I will say this, and we're going to hear a clip later on in the podcast from Sam Harris, where, basically, there are right and wrong answers in life. And I think everybody, when you start to get into ontological questions, you start asking big questions about belief and things, and you talk about subjective experience, and a lot of people will tell you that there are no right answers, but I don't necessarily think that's true. And another big thing that we're going to talk about here in this first episode, we'll get into the episode here in just a moment, but one of the things that I think is really, really important is that when we're talking about belief and we're talking about these questions, we have to have a starting point. And that's what this first episode is about. It's about starting points. Where should you start when you ask yourself these questions about the nature of reality and why you're alive and what happens after you die and what's going on? Because, let's be honest here. And I really hope that I can get at least a little bit of agreement here. What's going on right now to everyone is kind of weird. Existence is odd. There are a lot of things that go into existence that are strange. The fact that we exist at all is very, very weird. In fact, I'm kind of paraphrasing somebody who we're going to hear a lot of on the podcast, not this episode, but down the road. Alan Watts, who was a philosopher, very famous in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was one of the key people in bringing meditation, Buddhism, Hindu, Taoism, those kinds of Eastern religions, bringing those Eastern religions to the West. So he was very much about informing America and Europe about the way that other people in another part of the world, practice what a lot of people consider religion. And, we'll get into whether or not Buddhism and meditation is actually religion or not, which, I think a lot of people, especially myself, I would include myself in this. I had always assumed that it was, but it turns out I don't know if that's true, because now that I've started to dig a little bit deeper into what meditation actually is, I'm not entirely sure that Buddhism is incompatible with other systems of belief. And we'll talk about why that is. We'll talk about a lot of things. And by the way, if you have any questions that you think we should be asking, that not just on this podcast, but in general, just as people that we aren't asking, I would love to hear those questions. So please email me those questions, tjcarpenter.show@gmail.com. Also, once again, I want to ask everybody, if you are enjoying the podcast, please go to our GoFundMe page, provided a link in the post here that you can go to the GoFundMe page and donate to the show. Those donations, by the way, are going to go toward booking guests, production quality, which we've already gotten off to a great start. And eventually, I would like to say that, once we get to the point to where all of those things are taken care of, what I would like to do with the proceeds or profits of this show is, we can all kind of collectively come to an agreement on a charity or a donation of some kind, and then make that donation. So just keep in mind, if you like conversations like this, and not everybody does, I know a lot of people kind of push away the conversations about religion and politics and philosophy and the way that things are, because it can get very testy, especially with people who believe or feel like they know the way that the world is. And I can promise you this. I will make a number of promises about this show, but the first of which is this podcast is never going to be a place where we're going to debate the dogmas of different religions. Like, we're just, it's not something. I don't want this to turn into religion versus blank. I don't want this to turn into values, morality versus atheism, or any sort of judgmental position that you may have, either as a believer or as an atheist or as an agnostic, as somebody who can genuinely say that they don't know. And that's kind of where I'm at this point in my life. For a long time when I was a kid, I was raised religious, raised as in a Christian denomination. And then I became an atheist for a very long time, and I didn't believe in anything. And I didn't even ask. I didn't care. I cared about the some of the hypocritical things that you see a lot of times in organized religion. But I didn't really care about asking the question. I didn't really care about asking the question about what happens after we die, whether or not we're alone in the universe, whether or not there is a God, whether or not God is a thing, a person, nothing, the whole thing. Because all of those are options, right? Everybody has a different idea about what's going on. And I want to go through those ideas. I want people who are willing to say, okay, look, I've been through religion. I've been through at least one. And what I can tell you is that it's insufficient, And if you're that kind of person and you say, look, I believe there is something. I don't know why, but I do. And if you're that kind of person and you're like, you know what, I don't know. I don't believe in Christianity. I don't believe in Islam. I don't believe in, gods of any sort, monotheistic, polytheistic, whatever it is. I don't believe in gods. but I believe that there might be something. I don't believe that religion has it right, but I think there's something out there. And if you're that kind of person, you're not alone. And I think that there's never really been a comfortable space for people who are willing to say, I'm not sure religion has it right, but I don't think there's nothing. I think there's something. And whether that came from a religious experience that you had, whether that came from drug use, which we'll also get into that. Psychedelics, I think, are probably underutilized and we don't really know a whole lot about psychedelics and the way that they affect the brain. But you can have people who are very, very rational. And I think, Sam Harris is probably the best example of this. Sam Harris, I think, if you had to give an award out for the most rational human being alive, Sam Harris would probably win. And one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of Sam Harris and the way that he thinks about these problems, these questions, is that you're talking about somebody who is willing to accept that spirituality is real, but that you're not going to get accurate information from just accepting what somebody has told you in a book that's thousands of years old, that didn't have the advantages of hindsight and technology and science and the advancements of civilization. I mean, it's kind of like basketball or sports in general. In the 50s, you would see football players that weighed 160 pounds, and they're linemen, they're like offensive linemen. And, you fast forward 70 years and all of a sudden it's like that guy couldn't make it in today's sports, right? I would not be able to be a professional athlete today. 70 years ago, maybe. It's a possibility. People were different. They were just a different shape back then. And I think the same thing is true about our belief systems. We need new belief systems. And not necessarily to say that the way in which values have been created is wrong, but I'm not necessarily sure that we're 100% accurate on exactly how they got created. So if that's true, we should probably figure out some new things to think. We should start thinking about these problems in different ways. So that's what I hope this podcast is. I hope that we can ask questions that are going to be taken in the spirit with which they were intended. I'm not questioning whether or not you feel a certain way. I know you're going to feel one way or another, right? You're going to have some sort of opinion. It's either going to annoy you that somebody is disagreeing with your religious belief. You're going to listen to it because you're willing to accept differing viewpoints. Or you're going to offer up your own and say, look, I may disagree with the way you see things, and I may disagree with the way that all other religions see things, but I see things a certain way, and this is the way that I see them. That's okay. And I think that's not only is it okay, but I think we should encourage that. We should really encourage a free flow of ideas when it comes to belief, especially when it comes to something so fascinating. And I'm about to tell you why, because I realized something a few months ago, and it's rather odd because I don't know if I can really find any sort of belief system that is this simple or maybe this abstract, and that's maybe because it's a little bit of it's not necessarily cheating, and it's not necessarily a belief system in and of itself, but it is an absolute truth. And so that's where episode 1 is going to begin. And we're going to start it right now. When it comes to belief, where do you start? When I was born into a Christian household. My father was baptized when he was 20. My mother was raised to be very religious. And both of them raised myself and my brothers to be religious, to believe in something, to believe not only that we had a purpose in life, but they told us what that purpose was, and they also gave us hope for the future. And a lot of people look towards religion for that hope, because religion satisfies a lot of the questions that can plague people day after day after day, night after night after night, year after year after year. And as somebody who has been plagued by these questions, I can definitely tell you that it's hard. It's hard to want to believe in something and then find all of the options at your disposal lacking. But then when you start to realize that you don't need any of those options, it makes belief interesting. And what I mean by that is that if you are going to try to start your own belief system, and a big question that religious people who are very, very starkly in one corner or another, they believe in God, right? They are religious. They believe in God. They believe in a specific doctrine, religious, whether the Episcopalian or Pentecostal or Baptist, evangelical, Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, regardless of what it is, Islam. And I know there are many different, just like in Christianity, there are thousands of different belief systems within Christianity. There are many different belief systems within Islam. And those are the two major monotheistic religions. And those are the two religions that most people, and Judaism obviously, but Christianity is probably what most people who are listening to this right now are very familiar with. And Christianity provides a lot of answers to those questions. What happens to us when we die? Is there an afterlife? Why do we exist? All of those things, all of those questions are answered in one way or another, and they may be satisfactory answers or not to you, but they are answered in usually a holy text, right? And in the Christian case, it's the Bible. So you get a lot of stuff from the Bible. And what we've seen, and what I think is very interesting about those belief systems, and I think what kind of undermines those belief systems in terms of being followed dogmatically, is that a lot of people will keep some stuff and leave others. That's why we have different denominations. It's like, oh well, I interpret this differently because my situation says that I should, and that's really where kind of how it works. But if you're like me and you were raised in an environment like that, and you took it really seriously, I took Christianity extremely seriously as a kid. I read the Bible 11 times, cover to cover. That's not a lie. That I really did. I was as I mentioned, my parents raised me in a Christian household, and they were extremely religious. So a lot of my upbringing involved Bible study. I studied hours upon hours upon hours. I attended hours upon hours of schooling and study and different meetings all throughout the week for 25 years. So my familiarity with the Bible is pretty good. I don't know the Quran. I don't know any Buddhist, Taoist texts. I'm not an expert on religion. I'm really only speaking from my experience, which is limited. But what I can tell you is that I was raised to believe one thing, and then once you get to an age where you can start to think critically for yourself, I found the evidence to back up those beliefs lacking. And this is one of the really big problems that Christianity in particular, but all religious beliefs have with science or with facts or with any sort of provable desire, any sort of desire to prove something true. That is really, really kind of at odds with belief, because belief likes its subjectivity, which is interesting to me, because if you start taking a look at the split between religion and science, which does exist, and I don't think that it should, and we'll get into why a little bit later, But if you get into the split between science and values, or science and belief, or faith, whatever you want to call it, a belief in something more, something, an existence outside of existence, you start thinking about those things. And the main difference, between those divisions for most people is that science is good at answering how. My beliefs tell me why. And, I understand that that is a very easy catch-all solution for problems that you may not want to deal with. But if you are being intellectually honest with yourself and you're trying to answer these questions, that's not sufficient. And so after kind of going through the religious phase of my life, I entered into a non-belief phase for quite a while, where I was an atheist and pretty ardent, and I would still really kind of consider myself an atheist. However, I don't think that there's nothing, and we'll get into that here in just a second. But after that, I really started to say, okay, well, let's start from scratch. All right, clean slate. Let's get rid of all of the dogmatic belief systems that have ever come into existence ever. Let's just stop thinking about them for a second. Don't think about religions. Don't think about it. Think about only one thing. And this is the foundation of all religion, right? Is that what they are saying is absolutely true. So if you speak to a Muslim and they say, well, they say the Quran is truth, right? It's absolutely true. Everything about the book is true. And then in Christianity, you'll have various degrees of that. Like my parents would say that the Bible is a divinely inspired text. Therefore, it came from God, who is infallible. Therefore, the text is infallible. Therefore, you have to obey it. And that's pretty dogmatic. You have to have a lot of belief that everything in that book is true, that the origin point of that book, everything in that book, is 100% true. So, that is where we have to start. We have to find something that is absolutely true. And some people would tell you that absolute truth does not exist, that there is only subjective truth, that absolute truth is a myth, that everything is subjective relative to whatever reference point you've given it. And that's where I would like to start. And that's where I think if you are trying to start from scratch in believing in something without religion, you have to find that origin point. And I am going to say something, and this is really the only time where I will be absolutely adamant that I am correct. There is only one truth in the universe. Just one. That's it. And you build, in fact, we all build our value systems and our drives and everything about our human experience off of this one truth. And that is that consciousness is real, and that consciousness is the experience of being you. And that's the title of this podcast. It's the first half of Rene Descartes' infamous quote, "I think, therefore I am." And the reason why I called this podcast, "I Think, Therefore I Am," is because that is the only truth. It's the only truth. And the reason why we know that it's the only truth, and you can extend it here to a more advanced modern day version of this quote, but "I think, therefore I am" simply means that if I am thinking and I'm questioning the true nature of my own existence, I must exist. If I think, I am, because I cannot question my own existence without first acknowledging that I exist. So, that's why we call this "I Think, Therefore." Because "I think, therefore I am" is the starting point for absolutely everything in your life. And, that may sound obvious, but if you are trying to build a belief system, if you're trying to build a value system, you got to start somewhere. And if you are not using the crutches of religion and just saying, hey, you know what, I found a guy who knows this book, and he says that this book, it's got all the answers. And, like a lot of people, that's sufficient for them. It's not sufficient for me, and it's not sufficient, I think, increasingly for younger people. It's not sufficient for people who have lived enough life to know that there is only a certain amount of days that they've got. And in reality, if we're being completely 100% honest with ourselves, we do not know what happens after we die. We don't know what happens. And while I can say we're all real, or at least I can say I am real. I don't know if you guys are real. It could all be a simulation. I could be the only person. I can only, without any question, out any contestation, undeniably true. I don't have to prove to myself that I'm real, right? Because I can just question am I real? And the nature of the question proves that I am. I think, therefore I am. So let's talk about consciousness as a starting point for all of this stuff, for belief. So if we know one thing is true, it's the only absolute truth in the universe. It's the only absolutely true thing that you could ever say in any language. That's it. It's the only thing. And if it's the only thing that you can absolutely, without a doubt, know is true. And when I say without a doubt, there are a lot of Christians out there and a lot of Muslims out there and a lot of Jewish people and people of multiple faiths. Whatever it is. There are a lot of devout people out there who can say, oh, I know without a doubt that X is true. But if you ask them, well, prove it to me, then they can't. Because, once again, we start talking about the objective facts of science versus the subjective realities people accept. And, those two things do not have to be mutually exclusive. So, let's start with consciousness. Let's hear from a really smart person. This is Sam Harris. And Sam Harris, as I was saying earlier, he's a very smart guy. He's got a lot of really good quotes. We're going to hear from him a lot during the podcast. But as I mentioned, there's a very simple definition for consciousness that is kind of undeniably true. Here is Sam Harris on consciousness.
Consciousness is what it's like to be you. If there's an experiential, internal, qualitative dimension to any physical system, then that is consciousness. And we can't reduce the experiential side to talk of information processing and neurotransmitters and states of the brain in our case, because and people want to do this. Someone like Francis Crick said famously, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons," and that misses the fact that half of the reality we're talking about is the qualitative experiential side. So when you're trying to study human consciousness, for instance, by looking at states of the brain, all you can do is correlate experiential changes with changes in brain states. But no matter how tight these correlations become, that never gives you license to throw out the first-person experiential side. That'd be analogous to saying that if you just flipped a coin long enough, you would realize it had only one side.
So what Sam Harris is saying there is, first of all, a reiteration of the definition of consciousness, right? It's like something to be you. That quality of what it's like to be you is consciousness. And that quality is subjective. That qualitative experience of being you is separate from the mechanical processes that go on in the brain that create it, so to speak, right? That and that's kind of what Sam Harris is saying, is that those are two separate things. And trying to say that they're the same thing is like saying that a coin only has one side. Obviously, it doesn't. So, what he's talking about here is the hard problem of consciousness. And this is where I think I might freak a few of you out, but think about this for a moment. What he is saying is that the thing that I just said, right? Consciousness being absolutely true. The only absolutely true statement you can make without any possible debate. You will win any debate you have with somebody who tries to debate you whether or not your experience is real. You will win because you know it's real. You can't question the nature of its reality without it being real. So what he's saying is that is not scientifically provable. Think about that. All of this existence that we have is absolutely true and yet not scientifically provable. I can't prove to you through science that you're real. You just know it. That's really, really strange. Because once again, when we're talking about things that are absolutely true, you would think that it falls into the scope of science. It falls into the scope of a question science has answered. Oh, well, gravity's real. That's an absolute truth. Well, gravity is relative. We know this because of Einstein. So, the way that those physical forces behave, we know that there are physical forces in the universe, but we don't know what's producing them. We don't know the origin point of those. We don't know where the universe came from. We don't know why it's here. We don't know any of those things. All we know is that we're real. So the difference between the provable stuff in your brain, the synapses firing and the way it correlates to memory and different motor functions and things like that, versus the experiential, qualitative experience of what it's like to be you, are two different things. And so it's what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And the person who coined that phrase is David Chalmers. And here is David Chalmers explaining, kind of to reiterate what Sam Harris said, the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem, by contrast, is the problem of how it is that all these processes give rise to subjective experience. And what's distinctive about this is it doesn't seem to be a problem about objective mechanisms. We could tell a complete story about the objective mechanisms in the brains, the neurons that fire, the behaviors they produce, and so on. And there might still be a further question. Why is all that associated with subjective experience? But it's a question which right now our scientific methods don't have a very good handle on.
So just as I said, science can't answer why the only absolute truth in the universe is true. That's amazing. That's absolutely astonishing to me. And a lot of it is, not necessarily that I think science can't answer that question, but there are a lot of problems that science has right now that prevent it from answering that question. And, the hard problem of consciousness, and there are a couple of things that we're going to talk a lot about over the course of the existence of this podcast. And one of them is going to be the measurement problem. And so, a lot of what is limiting science's ability to find answers to these questions is the fact that we've basically measured all the stuff that we can measure without measuring stuff that's faster than the speed of light. And so the measurement problem is a preventative thing, right? You can't measure physical forces in the universe without photons from light. So you have to observe something in the physical universe. You can't do that if something is moving faster than your measurement apparatus, which is why quantum mechanics is kind of they have a superposition problem, but it's called the measurement problem. There are some things in physics we can't measure, and I don't know this for sure, but if we were to someday learn that consciousness is somehow related to things that exist outside of what we can currently measure, it would not surprise me in the least. But as of today, the idea that we are all experiencing something and the idea that that is real is 100% true, and yet we can't prove it. And it's the only thing that we know is true. Everything else needs a reference point. Everything else. And to prove this, let's actually, before we do that, let's listen to Sam Harris again. I think this is a really cool quote from Sam Harris about Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat essay that he wrote in the 70s, which is once again kind of proving the reality of subjective consciousness.
Famously, the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a paper, a very influential paper in the early 70s, titled What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he said, we may never know, a bat experience could be totally unlike our own, but if it is like something to be a bat, if you switch places with a bat, that wouldn't be synonymous with just the canceling of experience, but you would be laid bare to a different domain of experience. Well, that is the fact of consciousness in the case of a bat. Whether we ever understand it or not, the fact that the lights are on, the fact that there is a perspectival, qualitative character there, that is what we mean by consciousness.
Okay, so subjective, there's a quality to being you. That's you. It's totally unique. It's also real. And that's what Sam Harris is saying, and what Thomas Nagel was basically trying to prove with the what it would be like to be a bat thing is that bats see the world in a different way than we do, and that qualitative experience is unique to that bat, just like your qualitative experience is unique to you, and your experiences are going to heavily impact that the way in which you build your value system, and that's really the next step. But you have to, once again, be able to ask all these why questions in some sort of context. You have to give yourself a context. And as I said, I believe, it's not that I believe it, it's that it is true. The only place in which we can, if truth is the ultimate goal of religion, to establish the truth of the universe, then you got to start with the only absolute truth that you know, which is you and your consciousness, that it's real, that your experience is real, and that there's a value system incorporated into that, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But it all has to originate somewhere. And this is one of the very interesting things about why questions, and one of the reasons why I'm starting this podcast is because, guys like the first time I heard this entire story from Richard Feynman, who's he passed away a while back, but he was a famous astrophysicist not astrophysicist, my apologies. He was a particle physicist. Richard Feynman, he worked on the Manhattan Project. He was famous for creating particle duality diagrams. They were called Feynman diagrams. It showed how subparticles interacted with one another. Is very smart guy. He was known as the Great Explainer because he was so good at making complicated ideas seem really simple. So here is Richard Feynman on asking why questions. And this is really, really important because he makes the point that I was making just a moment ago about all why question. When you ask a why question, like why does the universe exist? You got to have a reference point. You have to. Because you're asking a why question. So this is Richard Feynman. And by the way, if you have a chance, please go to YouTube and just Google Richard Feynman why, and you'll be able to watch the whole 7-minute clip. It's exceptional. It's kind of eye-opening. He's a very enlightening person, especially if you're interested in physics. And we'll talk a little bit about physics and belief and whether or not those two things can or should not be related at one point. In fact, we've got a lot of different topic ideas. But when you have to figure out where to start, where's your starting point, you got to figure out basically what you're asking is, what is the reference point for my morality? Well, Here's Richard Feynman on why.
If you get hold of two magnets and you push them, you can feel this pushing between.
By the way, and I would just like to say this up front, they're talking about magnets, but the point of this is not really about Richard Feynman. It's not about learning how magnets work. We all know how magnets work. The point is, when you're trying to explain how magnets work, you can go all the way down into infinity, and where somebody, you still don't even know what you're talking about. We're not going to play the whole clip, but at any rate, he's talking about why questions, but in the framework of answering a question about magnets.
Turned around the other way and they slam together. Now, what is it, the feeling between those two magnets?
What do you mean, what's the feeling between the two magnets?
There's something there, isn't there? I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now, what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And, well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's a reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? For example, Aunt Minnie is in a hospital. Why? Because she went out and she slipped on the ice and broke her hip. That satisfies people. It satisfies, but it wouldn't satisfy someone who came from another planet, knew nothing about things. First, you should understand why, when you break your hip, do you go to the hospital? How do you get to the hospital when the hip was broken? Well, because her husband, seeing that she had the hip was broken, called the hospital up and sent somebody to get her. All that is understood by people. Now, when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking why.
Okay, so that's the point. If we are not allowing something to be true, which is what's going on in religion, right? As I said, and you can definitely debate this, but you, like I said, you'll probably lose. You'll probably lose because you can't really debate your own existence. And that's what you have to do to establish that I think, therefore, I am is not a true statement. So when you're asking why questions about religious matters or belief matters, you have to allow for something to be true. Religions allow for God to be a reality. Not only that he's a reality, but it's an accepted reality, that reality is ironclad for everyone. It's all the same, and it's not different for anybody else, and it's very dogmatic. And all of a sudden, you start to look at the way in which God in the Bible was formulated, his character, his demeanor, his and I say him, he's referred to as a man in the Bible. So when I say he, it's really just in relation to the acceptance of what the Bible is saying, right? So you're already starting to make an enormous amount of assumptions just at the very beginning. You're assuming that God is like you, that God is a man, that God is vengeful, that he has jealousy, that he has favoritism for certain groups of people over others. You're starting to allow for a lot of things that we see in human society to be translated over to a deity that people have just kind of accepted and assumed is true, and without having any actual, there's no philosophical reality to God, right? It's not like, and I don't know, people have said like ontological, like the ontological question of God's existence. Does if there is a sum of all realities, and let's say God does not exist in 99% of them, but he must exist in one, because in all realities, all possibilities must be actualized. That means that the possibility of God existing, God not existing in two different universes, that if he exists in one, therefore he exists in all of them. That's the ontological argument for the existence of God. But it doesn't really work because it's not you're basically doing a switcheroo. Alan Watts talks about this where he says, people confuse signs or science with the real world. And that's true. Just because numbers on a page say a certain percentage of it's formulating a way of talking about something that's real, but the talking about it is not it, right? So like the trick there with the ontological proof of God's existence is it's really just sort of relying on tricks of grammar and verbiage, and accepting that, first of all, that there are multiple realities. We don't know that. The many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. Sean Carroll talks about this in his book, Something Deeply Hidden. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics states that we are creating an infinite amount of universes all the time, which we don't know that's true. Like I said earlier, there's a measurement problem in physics. And guess what? All of the statements about the many worlds theory which is, by the way, a very good interpretation of quantum mechanics. But the many worlds interpretation of quantum, or the Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics. By the way, if I'm speaking about stuff that is not familiar to you, I hope you look it up because it's all really cool stuff. I wouldn't look up Everett or Everettian quantum physics. I would look up many worlds theories and Sean Carroll. And I hope I can get Sean Carroll on as a guest at some point because he's got so many great theories about belief and belief systems and what we can accept and what we shouldn't accept. But I would hope at the very least he has some appreciation for the fact that we're trying to approach difficult, unanswerable questions with a scientific method of some kind. We're trying to figure out what we can believe absolutely and then build off of that. And then see how we build off of that and see whether or not we can take careful, considerate, accurate steps forward. Because that's really what I think, a lot of religion has missed out on, is that, you have locked yourself into a certain lane when you get into religion, right? If you become a Christian, you got to believe the way that the other Christians around you believe. If you are a part of a congregation, you are now a part of a unit, and your beliefs are kind of, they're beholden to the group. And so, there's a lot of danger in that, in not thinking for yourself. And so when it comes to, once again, asking why questions, be very careful about the assumptions that you're making, because you can't really make assumptions with why questions, because you start to realize that you don't have the answers that you think you do. And once again, to finish things up with Richard Feynman, here's the second half of his thoughts on why questions.
If you try to follow anything up, you go deeper and deeper in various directions. For example, you could go, why did she slip on the ice? Well, ice is slippery. Everybody knows that, no problem. But you ask, why is ice slippery? That's kind of curious. Ice is extremely slippery. It's very interesting. You say, how does it work? You could either say, I'm satisfied that you've answered me, ice is slippery, that explains it. Or you could go on and say, why is ice slippery? And then you're involved with something, because there aren't many things as slippery as ice. It's very hard to get. Greasy stuff, but that's sort of wet and slimy. But a solid that's so slippery, because it is in the case of ice that when you stand on it, they say, momentarily the pressure melts the ice a little bit, so you got a sort of instantaneous water surface on which you're slipping. Why on ice and not on other things? Because ice expands water expands when it freezes, so the pressure tries to undo the expansion and melts it. It's capable of melting it. But other substances contract when they're freezing, and when you push them, they're just satisfied to be solid. Why does water expand when it freezes and other substances don't expand when they freeze? All right? I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult a why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. You'll notice in this example that the more I ask why, it gets interesting after all. That's my idea, that the deeper a thing is, the more interesting it is.
And I would wholeheartedly agree with what Richard Feynman said there at the very end. And you'll find out that Richard Feynman is one of my favorite people. He says the key to life is looking at things from a different point of view, and I couldn't agree more. If you are not going out of your way to challenge your own beliefs, then I don't know if you're really giving yourself the due that you deserve, because you've basically just said, all right, I tried one thing, I like it, and I'm not trying anything else. I found it. Like, it's just amazing to me when people start talking about religion and the way that they believe the world is, and they say, I was raised as such and such. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. What are the odds that you won the lottery, you grew up in the right place at the right time, and right out of the gate, you got it right. And you never had to look at any other belief system. You never had to look at any other ideas about unanswerable questions. That you got it right from the get-go. I think that that's dumb. I mean, I like, if I had to try to explain that thought process independent of any of religion. Like, if you applied the same logic to buying a car, which is not nearly as important as religion, right? It's just a car. Of course, some people might say the car is more important than religion. But if you applied it to buying a car and you walked onto the first lot you stopped at, literally the nearest car lot to your house that you've never left. You've never left the house before, but now you've decided you want to venture out into the world and you want to buy a car. And the first lot you get to and the first car you see, that's the car you buy, and it's the best car in the world. It's the only car that works. That's what you're saying. That not only is the car that you bought the best car in the world, but that that all the other cars on the road are fake cars. It's just silly. It's just ridiculous. That you wouldn't look at more than one, right? That you wouldn't look any further. That you do no digging. And look, a lot of people start digging and then they dig really deep holes. They dig really far into the religion that they become a part of, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, or something else. It's you start to see just kind of how many assumptions were made and how many you start to realize, like, why false steps happen with religions. I'm not here to, admonish Christians, because, Pastor Carl down at the church on the corner, he wasn't killing people in the Crusades. So, like, I don't hold that against him, but the idea that was the first place that he started and that's the only place that he's ever been, and there's no need to ever ask the question again. There's no need to wonder. There's no need to question. I've had a hard time with that in my life. The idea that you don't ask questions. As I said, the show's all about questions. I want to ask questions. I want to ask questions because I think that there are really good answers out there, especially when it comes to the idea that if we figured out a place to start, if we're trying to create our own value system out of nothing from scratch, I'm not telling you to start a religion. I'm telling you to start your own spiritual journey. I mean, like, really start it from scratch. I mean, totally wipe your mind clear of every other preconceived notion you've ever had, and then just ask the simple question, what is absolutely true? Absolutely. Because I can only think of one thing. Everything else is relative to a reference point, as Richard Feynman pointed out. So all things in the universe are relative, except for one thing, and that is your consciousness, which is absolutely true and also not provable by science. And that's kind of where we start. That's the starting point. The starting point is that you're real, it's happening, you've only got a certain amount of time, and you know that the now, the experience of right now, is the only reality. You know, future's not reality. You can come up with the future in your mind, but the future hasn't happened yet. So the future's not real. The future never gets here. It's only just now, right? The reality of now. And we're all just trying to get back to now. That's what a lot of consciousness and, the point of life seems to be. That consciousness is a natural phenomenon emerging out of the universe. So if we know that that's a natural phenomenon occurring in the universe, emerging out of the universe, that the well-being of conscious creatures is not all defined, is not well defined perhaps, but that doesn't mean that it's false. Just because, the idea that, the well-being of conscious creatures being a really huge factor in our value system, not being well defined, does not mean that it's not true. Our value system is based off of the idea that our conscious experience, our well-being as a conscious creature is real. That's how we measure our lives, whether we're happy, sad, successful, failing, regardless of what you want to call it. That all has to be true. So, let's talk a little bit now about, since we've kind of established where to start, I want to spend the last few minutes leading into what the second episode is going to be about, which is a topic of science versus values. Because, as I mentioned at the outset of this, a lot of people believe that science and values, or science and morality systems, are not compatible. And Sam Harris does a really good job of explaining why he believes that that's not the case.
I'm going to talk to you tonight about the relationship, as I see it, between science and human values. Many people think this relationship is somehow problematic, usually because they think that the universe is parceled into these separate quantities. On the one hand, we have facts, which obviously science can deal with. But on the other, we have values, which inconveniently for us cover the most important questions in human life, and it's thought science really can't touch these. Questions of right and wrong and good and evil, the core issues of how to raise our children, what proper goals we should strive for in life. And it's thought that while science may be able to help us get what we value, it can never tell us what we ought to value. And I want to push this intuition around because I think this is an illusion. I think the split between facts and values is an illusion.
That's a very interesting statement, that the split between science and values is an illusion, or the split between facts and values is an illusion. And when we talk about values, I'm talking about things that you consider to be right and things that you consider to be wrong. Telling the truth is a value. That telling the truth is a good thing. That protecting your family is a good thing. That loving your children is a good thing. Those are values. That murder is wrong. That's a value. And so when he says, look, that's an illusion. The idea that telling us what to value is as opposed to how to get it is not a question for science, but rather a question for subjective religions to answer. And I think he's right. I don't think that that's true. I think that you can come up with your own values simply by following the obvious path from our starting point, which is that there's a quality to being us, and that we want the quality of our lives, our experiences as conscious creatures, to be as good as possible. And really the only thing that you need to understand in order for that to be true is that, oh, hey, I'm trying to enhance the experience of my, I'm trying to enhance my conscious experience, or I'm trying to maximize the well-being of my conscious experience. The only thing that you need to know for that to be true is that, hypothetically, if the sum of all human experience was the worst possible experience, and that all other experiences would be better, that if you acknowledge that that's bad, that if all of humanity had the worst possible pain and suffering for their entire lives, every single human in existence had the worst possible pain and suffering in their life, and then died, and that there was still meaning in that life, that there was still value in that life, I would say that you don't know what you're talking about. Explain it to me, if that's what you believe. That even if all people did nothing but suffer, because in reality, what we know is true is that people suffer and then they also have joy, and that those two things seem to be inseparable, just as inseparable as the concepts of the mechanics of consciousness versus the qualitative experience of consciousness. Those two things are different things. So, listening to Sam Harris talk about science versus values, I think is very interesting. To say that it's an illusion, that science and values are not compatible with one another, is an illusion, is a very strong statement. Here is more from Sam Harris and how values reduce to facts about conscious creatures. And that's how we know that you can create a value system without religion.
I actually think the connection between facts and values is actually quite straightforward. Values reduce to facts. They reduce to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures.
Straightforward. So they reduce to facts about conscious creatures. Yeah, and I think that that's true. So if you know that your belief system is, you believe in it and it's not you, start thinking about the really positive influences and that those values have had on you, and then ask why. Why is murder wrong? Well, because if you murder somebody, then their experience as a conscious creature ends prematurely. It ends sooner than it could have ended, and you caused that. We can say without a doubt that by doing so, you've violated a value. What are you valuing? You're valuing what you know. You're valuing experience. You're valuing consciousness. That's why murder is wrong. And so you start to realize, oh, it's built into me. It's built in. All of those things that I value, all of the moral virtue that I have assigned to previously to a deity, is really already there in me. And it has an origin point that's absolutely true. And I'm not going to say that this is true with every question that we're going to ask over the course of this podcast, but I think that that's a great place to start. And look, there are right and wrong answers in life. There are some people who value the wrong stuff. There is. And we know that because it is misaligned with this tree of morality that we're creating out of the necessity for our own well-being as a conscious creature. And look, if you disagree with this as a starting point for belief, that's more than okay. I would love to hear your rebuttals. In fact, I know that coronavirus has caused a lot of issues when it comes to travel. It's definitely caused some issues for us. I will be hosting this podcast along with Patrick Evard, who's a good friend, and we had done some broadcasts last football season together. Great guy, and also a very religious man. He works at a church. I believe he does some youth pastor work and things like that. But he's going to come to this show with a different perspective than I am. And so while my perspective is going to be certainly one of science, I expect people who are very religious, people who have an established belief system, to come in and ask questions. To come in and really, with an open mind, not only question the things that I'm saying, but also question the things that they always say. And I think that that's the most important aspect of this podcast that I want everybody to remember, is that we're all about asking the questions. There's no such thing as a bad question. There's no such thing as a question that you shouldn't ask, or that doesn't have a place. We're going to ask these questions, but we're also going to live with the answers that we get, or the non-answers that we get, because I'm going to break it to you. A lot of this conversation is going to be about the experience of having it, and it's not going to be about the answers that we get. So you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn a lot about your own mind, I think. You're going to learn a lot about the belief systems of others. You're going to learn how easy it is, I think, to create a value system on your own. And I don't think people really understand why that is necessarily until they do it, and then they see it. So I hope you enjoyed this first episode. I know it was maybe a little hit and miss, touch and go there. It's episode number 1. We're going to get better. And then also, we're going to be doing a lot of shorter pieces as well, interviews as well on the podcast. This is episode number 1. Once again, I want to thank everybody who donated to the podcast: Aimee Miller, Canyon, Rob, Casandra, Aimee, all of you. Thank you so much for donating to the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing from you guys. I really do. And so, I know that there are a lot of people who are maybe curious about my religious upbringing and what that was all about. We will get to that at some point. But right now, I want to keep it to really some of these more abstract questions that, religion is maybe insufficient at answering for a lot of people in 2020, and that maybe they weren't so insufficient at answering in 1720, So I hope everybody enjoyed the podcast. I hope you made it this far. I want to thank you once again. And episode number 2 next week. My name is TJ Carpenter, and I think, therefore.